In the spring of 2023, the United States government did something it had done only a handful of times in its entire history. It offered $10 million, not for a terrorist, not for a warlord, not for someone who had attacked American soil directly, but for a single piece of information, a location, a name spoken by the right person at the right time. $10 million for one man. That man had never given an interview. He had not been photographed in a confirmed image in over a decade. He did not have a verified social media presence, a known address, or a public face. What he had was an organization that, at the time the reward was posted, operated in 27 of Mexico's 31 states and had active cells in more than 40 countries across 5 continents. His cartel moved cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and fentanyl on a scale that made the operations of Pablo Escobar, the name most people reach for when they imagine the peak of drug trafficking power, look like a regional distribution problem. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Escobar, at his peak, was estimated to control 80% of the world's cocaine supply. He was famous, photographed, televised, hunted in plain sight. The man this story's about controlled supply chains that Escobar couldn't have imagined, across chemicals, continents, and corrupted governments, and almost nobody outside of law enforcement can describe his face from memory. The DEA called him the most powerful drug trafficker in the world. The US Treasury froze assets connected to his organization across a dozen countries. The reward for Escobar, when American agencies joined the hunt in the early 1990s, never reached $10 million. His name is Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The world knows him as El Mencho. The mountain roads in Jalisco State, Mexico, are not built for military convoys. They were built for farmers, for mule paths worn into asphalt over decades, for the kind of slow traffic that has always moved through those hills. On the morning of May 1st, 2015, a convoy of Mexican federal forces moved into those mountains anyway. The mission was a raid. Intelligence had placed a significant CJNG operation in the area. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, El Mencho's organization. The convoy was armored, professional, and acting on what the commanders believed was solid information. They never completed the operation. What happened next was not an ambush in the traditional sense, a roadblock, a firefight, a retreat. What happened was something that rewrote the operational understanding of what a drug cartel was capable of in the 21st century. The convoy was hit from multiple positions simultaneously. The weapons used were not pistols or even military rifles. The CJNG fighters used rocket-propelled grenades. One of those grenades struck a military helicopter that had been providing air support. The helicopter came down. 8 soldiers died. 8 soldiers, a downed helicopter, on Mexican soil, from a cartel. The Mexican military had fought cartels for years. They had lost men in ambushes, in firefights, in targeted assassinations. But a helicopter, a state military aircraft, shot out of the sky by a criminal organization, that was different. That single event forced governments, analysts, and intelligence agencies to reclassify what the CJNG was. It was no longer categorized as a drug trafficking organization that used violence to protect its business. It was reclassified as a paramilitary force that also happened to traffic drugs. The distinction matters more than it sounds. It changed who was responsible for stopping them. It changed what tools could legally be used. It changed every negotiation between Washington and Mexico City about how to handle the organization operating out of those Jalisco mountains. When the soldiers who survived that 2015 operation eventually reached the area they'd been sent to raid, they found vehicles that had been burned, not recently, suggesting the intelligence had been days old before it reached the commanders. They found evidence of a camp that had been dismantled with disciplined speed. And on one concrete wall at the edge of what had been the camp's outer perimeter, they found a message. It had been spray-painted in black, in large letters, clearly meant to be read. What that message said will not be explained here. Not yet. Because understanding what those words meant, really understanding why soldiers stopped talking when they saw it, why the photograph of that wall was classified before it reached the press, why one general who was briefed on it reportedly left the room and didn't return for 20 minutes, requires knowing the full story of the man who ordered it written. That story begins not with power, not with weapons or helicopters or $10 million rewards. It begins with dirt floors and borrowed shoes, with a family of 11 children in a part of Mexico where the only people who drove good trucks worked for men who didn't appear on any government registry, with a young man who looked at those trucks and made a decision that seemed, at the time, like the safest choice available to him. He became a police officer, and somehow, through a chain of events that involved an American prison, a cartel war, a marriage that would reshape the finances of an entire criminal empire, and decisions made in the dark mountains of Jalisco over 30 years, that police officer became the man whose name the US government would one day pay $10 million just to locate. How does that happen? The first problem with telling the story of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes is that nobody agrees on where it starts. Official Mexican records place his birth on July 17, 1966, in Cayenne, a municipality in Sonora, the northern desert state that borders Arizona. Other documents, including some compiled by American intelligence agencies, point to the western state of Michoacán, specifically to a small municipality called Aguililla, a name that will appear again later in this story under very different circumstances. Even the basic biographical fact of where this man was born is, depending on which government file you read, a matter of dispute. That ambiguity is not an accident. It will become a pattern. What is not disputed is the family. Nemesio was one of 11 children. His father worked seasonal agricultural labour, the kind of work that follows harvests rather than schedules, that pays per day rather than per week, that leaves a family of 13 people calculating whether there is enough food from one month to the next. The house had a dirt floor in at least some of its rooms. Shoes were shared between siblings when the occasion required shoes. These are not dramatic details added for effect. They appear in the testimony of people who knew the family during those years, people who were interviewed decades later when researchers began trying to reconstruct who this man had been before the world knew his name. Jalisco State, where the family eventually settled, sits on Mexico's Pacific coast. The landscape is dramatic in a way that has nothing to do with tourism. The Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range cuts through its interior. Deep ravines, steep roads, microclimates that change within a few kilometers. The valleys between the mountains grow agave for tequila, which is Jalisco's famous export, the one that appears on bottles in bars across the world. But those same valleys and hillsides, in the decades when Nemesio was growing up, were also producing something else. Poppy fields, hidden in the folds of terrain that made aerial surveillance difficult and ground patrols exhausting. The people who farmed those poppies were not criminals in the way most people picture criminals. They were farmers who had been growing poppies for generations in some cases, because the soil was right and the money was real, and nothing else the land could produce came close to the price the buyers offered. The buyers drove good trucks. They paid on time. They were, in the economic logic of rural Jalisco in the 1970s and 1980s, the most reliable business partners in the region. Nemesio watched this as a child. Every child in those communities watched it. the question that shapes everything about his early life is the question of paths. In rural Jalisco in the early 1980s, a young man with no family money and no university connections had a limited number of realistic options. He could migrate north, to Guadalajara, to Tijuana, eventually across the border to California, joining the millions of Mexicans who moved toward American agricultural work or construction. He could stay and farm, which meant a life of exactly the kind of subsistence his father had lived. Or he could find work with the organizations that everyone in the community knew about but nobody named directly. He chose none of those three. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes became a municipal police officer in Tomatlan, a small town on the Jalisco coast. He took the uniform, the badge, the salary, modest even by Mexican government standards, and began working on the correct side of the law. This is not a small fact. It is not a footnote. It is the foundation of everything that comes after, because it means that the man who would eventually build one of the most violent criminal organizations in history began his adult life by actively choosing legitimacy. He had access to a weapon through the state. He had authority. He had a salary. He had for the first time a position that placed him above the economic scramble his family had always lived inside. The Tomatlan police force in the late 1980s was not large. The town itself sits between the mountains and the Pacific, a place most travellers pass through rather than stop in. What the town did have, what the entire coastal corridor of Jalisco had, was geography that made it extraordinarily useful for moving things from the water inland and then north. Boats could come in from the Pacific. Product could be transferred to vehicles. Vehicles could disappear into the mountain roads. The municipal police knew this. They had always known it. Here is what the records show about those years. Nemesio served. He did his job. There are no accounts of him being a brutal officer, no documented incidents of him becoming notorious in the town for any particular behaviour. He was, by the available evidence, a functional, unremarkable local policeman in a coastal town that happened to sit at the intersection of several important criminal geography lines. But the Jalisco of the late 1980s was not a stable place to be a policeman. The Guadalajara cartel at that moment was the largest and most powerful drug trafficking organization in Mexican history, arguably in the history of the hemisphere. Its leader, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, a man known as El Padrino, the Godfather, had done something no Mexican trafficker before him had managed. He had unified all the major trafficking routes under a single organizational umbrella. Sinaloa, Tijuana, Juarez, the Gulf, all of it, in the mid-1980s, ran through Felix Gallardo's network. The Guadalajara cartel was paying off federal police, state police, municipal police, and military officers systematically, not opportunistically. It wasn't a matter of individual officers taking bribes. It was a managed system of institutional corruption that operated like a tax. The cartel paid the police, and the police in return looked in whatever direction they were told to look. A young municipal officer in Tomatlan, Jalisco, was not exempt from that system simply because he had chosen to wear a uniform. The exact nature of Nemesio's relationship with the Guadalajara cartel during his time as a police officer is not documented in any public record. What is documented is what happened after, and what happened after suggests that the relationship between the man in the uniform and the men in the good trucks had become, at some point during those coastal Jalisco years, something that could not be undone. He left the police force. The timeline of when, exactly, and under what circumstances is another detail that blurs in official records. What came next would take him across an international border, through the American legal system, and into a federal prison in California, a place where, against every reasonable expectation, the real education began. By the late 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel had a problem it hadn't anticipated: success. The organization had grown so large, moved so much product, and accumulated so much money that it had become impossible to manage invisibly. The American DEA, humiliated by the 1985 torture and murder of their agent Enrique Camarena, killed on Felix Gallardo's orders, had made dismantling the Guadalajara cartel an institutional obsession. Mexican authorities, under enormous pressure from Washington, began making arrests they previously would have avoided. The walls were closing in on El Padrino. Felix Gallardo's response to this pressure was characteristically calculated. Before his own arrest in 1989, he did something that restructured Mexican organized crime for the next 3 decades. He called a meeting. In a house in the city of Acapulco, he gathered the major operators within his organization and divided the territory. Each trafficking corridor, Tijuana, Sinaloa, Juarez, the Gulf Coast, was assigned to a specific family or operator. The unified cartel became a federation of independent regional powers, each inheriting a piece of the infrastructure El Padrino had built. The Jalisco corridor went to the Valencia family. This division would matter enormously to Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, but not yet. In the early 1990s, he was not a significant enough figure to sit at any table where territories were being discussed. He was operating at a level far below the Acapulco meeting, doing the work that didn't require a name, moving product north through the supply chains that the Guadalajara cartel had spent years establishing along the Pacific coast. That work eventually took him across the border. Fresno County, California, 1992. The Central Valley, flat, agricultural, bisected by Highway 99, a corridor that connects the farming communities of inland California and also, for decades, served as one of the primary inland distribution routes for drugs entering through the southern ports of entry. Fresno was not a glamorous posting for a drug trafficker. It was a working city, a logistics city, a place where product moved through rather than stayed. Precisely the kind of city that was useful for exactly the operation Nemesio was running. He was arrested on heroin charges. The details of the arrest are contained in US federal court records that became relevant years later, when American prosecutors began building the case against the man he would become. In 1992, he was nobody to the American justice system, a low-level Mexican national court moving heroin in Fresno County, processed through the federal system, sentenced and placed in a federal correctional facility. His fingerprints were taken. His photograph was filed. His name, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, entered the DEA database, and stayed there, largely unexamined for over 2 decades. That detail, fingerprints collected in 1992 sitting in a federal database while the man grew into the most wanted drug trafficker in the world, is one that American law enforcement officials would later struggle to explain. Not because the system failed in any dramatic way, but because in 1992 there was nothing in that file to suggest it would ever matter beyond a routine narcotics arrest. He was one of thousands of names processed through the system that year. Inside, that is where the story shifts. Federal prison in the United States operates on a logic very different from Mexican incarceration. The facilities are regimented, controlled, procedurally consistent in a way that the Mexican prison system, chronically underfunded, frequently infiltrated by the organizations whose members it housed, was not. For a man who had grown up navigating institutional corruption, who had worn a uniform in a police force that operated partially as an extension of criminal networks, the American federal system represented something genuinely new. It also represented, for anyone paying close enough attention, a masterclass in how institutions function. Nemesio served his sentence. He was not a notable prisoner, no documented disciplinary incidents, no recorded conflicts that made it into the file. He learned English during those years, not fluently at first, but functionally. The ability to understand what American law enforcement officials were saying without a translator. to read documents written in English, to follow proceedings without depending on interpretation. That skill would have specific operational value later in ways he could not have fully planned but certainly recognized. There is something worth pausing on in those prison years, not the suffering of incarceration, that goes without saying. But the particular quality of attention that imprisonment forces on a person who is not broken by it. Every system he was now inside, legal procedures, classification systems, communication monitoring, visitation protocols, the hierarchy of federal versus state jurisdiction, was visible to him in its mechanics in a way it never is from the outside. He was studying without intending to study. He was released and deported back to Mexico in the mid-1990s. The Mexico he returned to was unrecognizable from the one he had left. Felix Gallardo was in prison. The unified cartel he had built was gone. In its place was a collection of regional organizations that were increasingly in conflict with one another as the boundaries El Padrino had drawn began to blur and overlap. The Arellano Felix brothers controlled Tijuana with a violence so theatrical it had become its own kind of news. The Sinaloa operation, now under figures who would eventually coalesce around a man named Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo, was expanding aggressively. The Gulf Cartel had acquired a paramilitary enforcement wing called the Zetas, recruiting former Mexican Special Forces soldiers and transforming what had been a smuggling operation into something that functioned more like an army. Every criminal organization in Mexico was growing. Every one of them was also simultaneously at war. Nemesio re-entered this landscape with something most of the people already operating inside it didn't have: perspective from the outside. He had seen how the American system tracked, processed, and prosecuted. He had watched an entire unified cartel collapse because it became too visible, too centralized, too dependent on a single leadership structure that could be arrested. He had also watched, from inside an American federal facility, what happened to organizations that left evidentiary trails, paper trails, phone records, witness accounts. He went to work for the Milenio cartel, which had emerged from the Valencia family's inheritance of the Jalisco corridor after the Guadalajara split. The Milenio operation was significant but regional. It controlled key Pacific coast routes but lacked the scale of Sinaloa or the institutional terror of the Zetas. For Nemesio, it was a starting position, a place to rebuild what prison had interrupted. He was not yet a leader, not yet a name. He ran operations, managed logistics, proved reliable in the way that advancement in any organization, criminal or otherwise, requires reliability first. Decisions got made and product kept moving, and in that world consistency was its own form of currency. But something was happening alongside the work, a connection forming, not with a cartel, not with a criminal structure, but with a family. Her name was Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia. She came from a family rooted in the same Western Mexican geography that had shaped Nemesio's own trajectory. Families who understood the landscape, who had built networks across Jalisco and Michoacán over generations, who had accumulated connections in legitimate business that sat alongside and served criminal finance. The Gonzalez Valencia family, known by the name the Queenies, were not enforcers. They were not the kind of family that appeared in shootout reports or ambush investigations. They were the kind of family that made sure money didn't disappear. The marriage between Nemesio Seguera Cervantes and Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia was the moment that two different kinds of power combined into something neither family could have built alone. He had operational knowledge, criminal credibility, and a growing network of loyal operators. Her family had financial infrastructure, real estate holdings, agricultural businesses, money movement capabilities that could absorb criminal proceeds and return them as clean capital. What they built together over the next decade would not yet have a name. It would take a specific catastrophe, a wave of violence from an outside force, and one decision made under pressure to transform a criminal alliance into a cartel. That catastrophe was already forming in a barracks, in a training facility in northern Mexico, in the minds of men who had been soldiers and were about to become something the country had never seen before. To understand what Nemesio was building through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, it helps to understand what a cartel actually is, not in the way the word appears in news headlines, but in the way it functions from the inside, at the level of daily operational reality. Because the popular image of a cartel, a single violent man at the top, giving orders that flow downward through loyal soldiers, is not just incomplete. It is precisely the opposite of what makes a sophisticated criminal organization survive. The Milenio cartel, which Nemesio entered after his deportation, operated on geographic logic. Jalisco's value to any trafficking organization was its position: Pacific coast access for maritime shipments, mountain roads that complicated surveillance, proximity to Guadalajara, Mexico's second largest city, which provided the population density, financial infrastructure, and transportation networks that any large-scale operation required. The cartel didn't control this geography through presence alone. It controlled it through relationships, with local officials, with transport companies, with the families who had farmed those hills for generations and knew which roads flooded in February and which mountain paths the army never patrolled. Nemesio understood relationships. It was, in many ways, the one skill that his background, police officer, trafficker, prisoner, deportee, had consistently reinforced. Every phase of his life had required him to read the people around him accurately and position himself correctly within the existing hierarchy. He had never, at any point, tried to seize power before the moment was right. That patience was structural to who he was. His role within the Milenio operation expanded gradually. He moved from logistics management into what might be called, in a legitimate business context, regional operations, overseeing the movement of product through specific corridors, managing the network of local contacts who made those movements possible, ensuring that the payments reaching the right officials arrived on time and in the right amounts. Late payments to corrupted police were as dangerous as no payment at all. They created resentment. Resentment created informants. He had learned that watching El Padrino's empire collapse. The Queenie family's contribution to this operation was not visible in any way that law enforcement could easily track in real time. Rosalinda's brothers, particularly Abigail González Valencia, who would eventually become one of the most wanted figures in Mexico in his own right, had built a financial network that operated through layers of legitimate business activity. Agribusiness was central to this. The avocado trade in Michoacán and Jalisco was, and remains, one of the most valuable agricultural markets in Mexico. Billions of dollars moving legally through export channels to the United States and Europe every year. A network of avocado farms, packing facilities, and distribution companies provided exactly the kind of high-volume, cash-intensive business that could absorb criminal proceeds without generating the financial anomalies that banking regulators were trained to flag. The money went in dirty. It came out clean, attached to invoices for fruit. Real estate served a parallel function. Properties purchased in the names of relatives, associates, or shell companies created assets that appreciated legitimately, could be sold or mortgaged to generate clean capital, and distributed the financial footprint of the organization across dozens of transactions that individually looked unremarkable. A house purchased by a cousin in Guadalajara, a commercial property in Puerto Vallarta, a small hotel near the coast. None of these, examined alone, triggered any alarm. Together, they formed the bones of a financial system sophisticated enough to fund a private army. This is the part of cartel life that never appears in the dramatic retellings. Not the guns, not the violence, not the bodies on highways, the accounting. The real power in any criminal organization of significant scale is not held by the person who authorizes violence. It is held by the person who controls where the money goes when it is clean. Because once money is clean, it generates legitimate power. Political connections, legal protection, institutional relationships that operate entirely within the formal economy and are therefore almost impossible to prosecute. Rosalinda and her family held that power. The world Nemesio was operating inside had its own internal physics, rules that were never written down but were understood by everyone who survived long enough to rise within the structure. The first rule was that loyalty was demonstrated through reliability, not declarations. A man who said the right things but missed a shipment deadline was worth less than a man who said nothing and never missed one. The second rule was that questions moved upward, never downward. A lieutenant asked his commander for clarification, never the reverse. Information was controlled by limiting its flow, and the person who knew the most about the overall operation was always the most dangerous person in the room. The third rule was the one that separated organizations that lasted from those that didn't. Violence was a tool, not a response. Uncontrolled violence, retaliation for its own sake, punishment delivered in anger, created witnesses, generated press coverage, and invited government intervention. Controlled violence, applied precisely and at the right moment, was administrative. A warning delivered once, a problem removed cleanly, no more than necessary to produce the desired effect. Nemesio applied these rules with a discipline that people inside the organization noticed. He was not known, during these years, for outbursts. He was known for decisions, for arriving at conclusions quickly and implementing them without the visible deliberation that betrayed uncertainty. In an environment where uncertainty was exploited immediately, that quality was its own form of protection. The Milenio cartel began to fracture around 2009. Internal disputes over money, territory, and succession, the perennial causes of cartel collapse, split the organization into competing factions. Some operators aligned with Sinaloa, seeking the protection of El Chapo's expanding network. Others tried to maintain independence. Nemesio watched this fragmentation with the same quality of attention he had turned on the American prison system years earlier. He was not fragmented. He was consolidating. The network he had built across Jalisco by 2009 was his own, not Milenio's, not Sinaloa's, not inherited from any prior structure. It was assembled relationship by relationship, plaza by plaza, over more than a decade of patient operational work. Operators who had worked under him stayed loyal to him specifically, not to whatever organizational banner they happened to be operating under at any given moment. That personal loyalty, rare in an environment where organizational allegiance shifted with every war and every arrest, was the asset he'd been accumulating the entire time. The Queenie financial infrastructure remained intact through all of it. Whatever happened to the Milenio cartel's political structure, the money-cleaning operation continued functioning. Product kept moving, revenues kept arriving, the agricultural export businesses kept producing invoices, but there was a force now approaching from the east that no financial infrastructure and no personal loyalty network could simply absorb or redirect. The Zetas, originally the Gulf Cartel's enforcement wing, now operating as an independent organization after a bloody split in 2010, were moving westward. They had been expanding their territorial control through a specific operational philosophy: maximum visible violence as a deterrent, applied immediately and publicly to any population or organization that resisted. Burned vehicles on highways, mass graves, public executions broadcast on early social media platforms. The Zeta's westward expansion was not a distant problem for Nemesio by 2010. It was arriving in territories where his operators worked, where his contacts lived, where his supply routes ran. He had two options: accommodate the Zetas, find an arrangement, pay a tax on his own operation, accept a subordinate position within their expanding territorial logic, or resist. The men closest to him during this period would later tell investigators, years after events had made the answer obvious, that there was never any real deliberation. The decision wasn't made in a meeting or announced in any formal way. It was evident in what happened next, in the specific, deliberate, escalating actions that followed, as clearly as if it had been filed in writing. He was going to resist. And the way he chose to announce that resistance to every criminal organization in Mexico simultaneously would become one of the most studied moments in the history of organized crime in the Western Hemisphere. Nobody outside his immediate circle knew it was coming, including the organization that was about to become his enemy. To understand what happened in the fall of 2011, it is necessary to understand what Mexico looked like in the 3 years before it. The country was not at war in any official sense. No declaration, no formal enemy, no defined battlefield. But between 2008 and 2011, approximately 50,000 Mexicans died in cartel-related violence. 50,000 in 3 years. That number exceeds the American combat deaths in the entire Vietnam War. It happened not in jungles or on foreign soil, but in cities, on highways, in markets, outside schools, in the fabric of ordinary daily life across a country that most of the world associated with beaches and tequila and colonial architecture. The trigger for this explosion was a fracture. In 2008, the alliance between the Gulf Cartel and its enforcement wing, the Zetas, collapsed after years of internal tension over money and control. The Zetas, originally recruited from Mexico's elite special forces, men who had been trained by American and Israeli military advisors in counterinsurgency tactics, didn't dissolve when the alliance broke. They became their own organization, and they brought with them a military operational doctrine that no previous cartel had possessed. They didn't just traffic drugs, they occupied territory, they taxed local populations, they recruited aggressively, absorbing local criminal groups across the Gulf Coast and northeastern Mexico, then pushing westward with a speed that caught every existing organization off guard. Nemesio had been watching the Zetas' expansion for 2 years by the time their operations began touching Jalisco. He had watched what happened to organizations that tried to negotiate with them. The Gulf Cartel's remnants had negotiated, and the result was slow strangulation as the Zetas absorbed their routes, their contacts, and eventually their personnel. He had watched what happened to independent operators in Veracruz and Tamaulipas who refused to negotiate. They simply disappeared, their bodies occasionally found, occasionally not. The Zetas' western expansion was not a threat on the horizon. By early 2011, it was a pressure felt in specific concrete ways, in operators going silent, in shipments delayed because the roads through certain areas had become Zeta territory overnight, in payments failing to arrive because the middlemen who carried them had made the mistake of being in the wrong place. Then, in the spring of 2011, the Zetas killed a group of men in Jalisco with direct ties to Nemesio's operation. The specific details of that killing, exactly how many men, exactly where, exactly which of Nemesio's network nodes it severed, are not fully documented in public records. What is documented is the response, and the response was not a counter-ambush, not a targeted retaliation against the specific Zeta unit responsible. What Nemesio did was something that required a different order of planning entirely. On September 20th, 2011, on a highway overpass in the port city of Veracruz, deep inside Zeta territory, not in Jalisco, not in any area where his organization had previously operated publicly. 35 bodies were dumped. The bodies were arranged, not scattered. They were placed with the deliberate geometry of a message, not the chaos of a firefight. Alongside them was a banner. The banner named the organization responsible, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. The name had not existed publicly before that morning. There had been no press releases, no intercepted communications announcing a new organization, no intelligence reports flagging an emerging group. The CJNG appeared in the world, fully formed, capable of a large-scale operation inside enemy territory, by placing 35 bodies on a highway overpass in Veracruz and signing its name. This was not impulsive. It could not have been. Transporting 35 bodies into Zeta-controlled Veracruz without being intercepted required intelligence about Zeta patrol patterns, contacts within the city, a transportation network that could move that volume invisibly, and the organizational discipline to execute a complex operation without a single element failing in a way that exposed the people involved. Every component of that operation had to have been in place before the decision was made. He had been building toward this moment. The CJNG was not born in September 2011. It had been assembling quietly for years. The Mexican government's response to the Veracruz massacre was immediate and visible. Press conferences, deployments, official statements about pursuing those responsible. What the response was not was effective. The CJNG, having announced itself through an act of spectacular violence, did not wait to be found. It moved. Within weeks of the Veracruz massacre, the CJNG began what can only be described as an offensive across multiple states simultaneously. Zeta-affiliated operators in Jalisco were targeted. In some areas, local criminal groups that had been paying Zeta taxes were offered a different arrangement, align with the CJNG and the tax stops, or refuse and face the same fate as the Zetas themselves. The choice, presented that way, was not genuinely a choice. Most groups aligned. The Mexican federal government, stretched across a war it was fighting on a dozen fronts against multiple organizations, had no capacity to respond to a new player with the speed the situation required. The government was also, in ways that nobody in an official capacity would state publicly, deeply infiltrated by the same organizations it was nominally fighting. Intelligence about upcoming operations had a way of reaching cartel leadership before the operations launched. Raids found empty buildings, arrests were made and cases collapsed in court. The information moved consistently in the wrong direction. Nemesio had built his organization knowing this, not as a vulnerability he had to work around, but as a feature of the environment he was operating inside, a feature he could exploit as systematically as the Zetas had exploited military training. 1,000 kilometers north of Veracruz, in the US consulate in Guadalajara, and in DEA field offices along the border, analysts were looking at the Veracruz massacre and asking a question that would define the next decade of American counter-narcotics efforts in Mexico. Where had this organization come from, and who was running it? The name Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes appeared in those early assessments. His 1992 arrest file was pulled from the database. The fingerprints taken in Fresno County 20 years earlier were re-examined, and the analysts looking at that file encountered a fact that created immediate, uncomfortable questions about what the American system had done with 20 years of opportunity. The file was real. The fingerprints matched. The name was correct. The man arrested in Fresno in 1992 for heroin trafficking had been processed, imprisoned and deported, and at no point in the subsequent 2 decades had anyone connected him to the emerging organization that was now rearranging the criminal geography of Mexico with mass killings. The DEA had known his name since 1992, but the question that file could not answer, that no file could answer in those early months of the CJNG's existence, was the one that mattered operationally. Where was he now? The CJNG's expansion through 2012 answered part of that question by geography. The organization's operations were concentrated in a specific arc: Jalisco, Colima, Nayarit, along the Pacific coast, then inland through parts of Michoacán and Guanajuato. The mountain infrastructure of Jalisco's Sierra Madre provided natural fortification. The Pacific ports provided maritime access. The Queenie financial network, moving money through agricultural exports and real estate, kept the funding clean and flowing. But Nemesio himself was nowhere that could be pinpointed. He communicated through intermediaries. He moved between locations in the mountain interior with a frequency and unpredictability that made surveillance pattern analysis impossible. No phone call was attributed to him with confidence. No confirmed sighting was logged after the early 2010s. The DEA analyst who was assigned to the CJNG case in Guadalajara during this period, a man who had spent 6 years in Mexico working organized crime before this assignment, noted something in his internal reports that his supervisors flagged as worth attention. Every time his team got close to a confirmed location for Mencho's operations, something happened before they could act on it. Not always an ambush, sometimes just silence. Contacts who stopped responding, sources who suddenly had nothing to say, information that dried up at precisely the moment it should have been flowing. He wrote in one report that it felt less like surveillance failure and more like counter-surveillance, like something was watching the people doing the watching. He was right. But at the time, he didn't know how right. Because what he couldn't yet see, what wouldn't become clear until years later, when arrests began producing testimony, was that the CJNG's intelligence operation wasn't just passive. It wasn't just bribed officials who happened to mention upcoming raids. The organization had, by this point, placed active operatives inside the Mexican Federal Police, inside certain state-level intelligence units, and, most troublingly, inside the networks of local contacts that the DEA depended on for human intelligence. The people watching El Mencho were being watched by El Mencho. And somewhere in the mountains of Jalisco, the organization was growing in directions that nobody in any government office had yet begun to map. International directions, chemical directions, supply chain directions that would, within a few years, reach into the daily lives of ordinary Americans in ways that had nothing to do with Mexico's internal cartel wars. The fentanyl era had not yet begun, but the infrastructure that would deliver it was already being built, route by route, contact by contact, in the systematic way that Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes had always built everything. One careful connection at a time. Between 2012 and 2015, the CJNG did something that no Mexican cartel had managed since the original Guadalajara operation of the 1980s. It went from a regional organization operating along one Pacific corridor to a national presence with international reach, not through a single dramatic expansion, but through a methodical, almost corporate process of absorption, alliance, and infrastructure replication. Every new territory followed the same pattern: identify the existing local criminal structure, offer an arrangement, provide the muscle to enforce the new relationship if the offer was declined, and then immediately plug the newly acquired territory into the existing financial and logistics network that the Queenies had built. The process was efficient because it didn't require Nemesio to be present in any of these locations. That was the design. Each regional cell operated with enough autonomy to function without direct contact with leadership. but within a framework of rules and financial obligations that kept the overall organization coherent. If one cell was arrested or destroyed, it couldn't produce testimony about the others, because it genuinely didn't know the operational details of any cell beyond its own immediate network. The DEA had a name for this architecture when they encountered it in other contexts. They called it compartmentalization. They had spent decades trying to build it into their own operations against criminal organizations. The CJNG had built it into its criminal organization against them. The cocaine supply chain was the first international dimension to take shape. Colombia's major cartels had fragmented over the years since Escobar, producing a landscape of smaller, more flexible trafficking organizations that were actively looking for reliable Mexican partners to move product northward. The CJNG's Pacific Coast infrastructure, boats, ports, mountain routes, was precisely what Colombian suppliers needed on the Mexican side. Agreements were reached. Shipment volumes increased. The CJNG began receiving Colombian cocaine in quantities that moved it from a regional player in the drug trade to a significant wholesale distributor within the American market. But cocaine, for all its value, had a ceiling. The American cocaine market was mature, competitive, and, for a new entrant trying to establish distribution networks inside the United States, structurally difficult to penetrate quickly. Sinaloa had spent decades building retail distribution relationships across American cities. Breaking into those markets meant either fighting Sinaloa for existing customers or finding customers that Sinaloa wasn't serving. The CJNG found a different answer entirely. Not a new customer, a new product. Methamphetamine manufacturing had been evolving rapidly through the early 2000s. Mexican cartels had largely displaced American domestic meth production by developing industrial-scale manufacturing operations in Mexico using chemical precursors, the raw ingredients from which meth is synthesized, imported primarily from China. The precursors arrived in shipping containers listed on customs documents as industrial chemicals, agricultural inputs, or manufacturing supplies. The containers moved through Mexican ports. The meth was manufactured in facilities that range from small rural labs to industrial operations capable of producing hundreds of kilograms per week. The CJNG invested in this manufacturing capacity with the same systematic approach it had applied to territorial expansion. Not one large facility that represented a single point of failure, but distributed manufacturing, multiple labs across multiple states, each producing at a scale that was significant but not so enormous that it attracted the kind of immediate government attention that a single massive operation would generate. The product then moved through the same logistics infrastructure that was already handling cocaine, flowing northward through Jalisco corridors and across the border. The DEA analyst based in Guadalajara, the one who had noted the counter-surveillance quality of CJNG operations in his 2012 reports, had been tracking the organization's expansion with a combination of professional focus and growing personal unease. His name was Daniel Ruiz, a 15-year agency veteran who had previously worked cartel cases in Colombia and had seen large organizations grow before. What he was watching with the CJNG felt different in a specific way that he struggled to articulate in the formal language of official reports. Most cartels, in his experience, expanded reactively. They took territory when it became available, responded to threats as they materialized, built supply chains by following existing relationships. The CJNG was expanding proactively, moving into territories before there was an obvious operational reason to be there, establishing relationships with foreign suppliers and distributors ahead of the volume that would eventually justify those relationships. It was, Ruiz wrote in one report, that his superiors found overstated, behaving less like a criminal organization scaling up and more like a company executing a 5-year plan. His informant network inside Jalisco had been producing useful intelligence through 2012 and into 2013. Then, over a period of about 4 months in late 2013, 3 of his most reliable sources went silent. Not arrested. He would have known about arrests. Not relocated. Silent. 2 of them were later found dead. The 3rd was never found at all. Ruiz requested additional resources. He was told the agency's Mexican operations were already stretched across active investigations in Sinaloa, Tamaulipas, and Michoacán. He submitted a formal assessment arguing that the CJNG represented a higher priority threat than current resource allocation reflected. The assessment was reviewed. The resource allocation didn't change. He kept working with what he had. May 1st, 2015 arrived like a confirmation of everything Ruiz had been writing about for 3 years, and a demonstration that the threat had already grown past the point where the existing response framework was adequate. The Mexican army convoy that moved into the mountains east of Guadalajara that morning was acting on intelligence that military commanders believed was current. The operation was designed to disrupt a CJNG logistics hub, a specific location where the organization was believed to be coordinating shipments across multiple routes simultaneously. The intelligence was not fabricated. The location had been a hub, but the CJNG had received warning of the operation from where, through which corrupted channel, has never been fully established in any public proceeding, and had repositioned. What stayed behind was not a logistics operation, it was a military one. The CJNG fighters who engaged the convoy were equipped not as criminal gunmen but as soldiers. Body armour, military-grade rifles, coordinated positions that demonstrated tactical planning rather than improvised response. When the army helicopter providing air support moved into engagement range, a rocket-propelled grenade tracked it. The helicopter came down in a field at the edge of the mountain road. 8 soldiers died in that helicopter. Another soldier died in the ground engagement. 9 men total in a single operation. The silence after that convoy engagement was of a particular quality. Not the silence of a completed battle. The silence of institutions trying to understand what category of event they had just experienced. The Mexican government's response over the following weeks was extensive and, in certain operational respects, effective. CJNG-linked properties were raided across Jalisco. Arrests were made at the middle management level of the organization, plaza bosses, logistics coordinators, financial administrators. Each arrest generated press coverage. Each press conference featured officials in front of seized vehicles, weapons, and cash, describing ongoing operations against the organization. Nemesio was not among those arrested. He was also, for the first time, globally named. The US Treasury Department designated the CJNG as a transnational criminal organization, a formal legal classification that enabled American agencies to pursue the cartel's financial assets internationally, freeze accounts linked to the organization, and pursue prosecutions under a broader legal framework than standard drug trafficking charges. The State Department posted the $10 million reward for information leading to Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The reward poster contained a photograph. It was a low-resolution image, taken sometime around 2012, showing a heavy-set man in his mid-40s. The image was so indistinct that multiple analysts who examined it noted it would be of limited practical use for field identification. It was the best image anyone had. It was, at the time the poster was published, already 3 years old. The most wanted drug trafficker in the world had managed, in an era of ubiquitous cameras and digital surveillance, to avoid being photographed with any clarity for years. This was not luck. Every person in Nemesio's immediate orbit understood, without being told in writing that cameras were prohibited in his presence. Phones disappeared before meetings. Anyone who produced a recording device in the wrong context did not require a second reminder. The CJNG's international expansion accelerated after 2015, rather than contracting under the pressure of American and Mexican government attention. This seems counterintuitive until the organizational logic becomes clear. The middle management arrests had removed personnel, but the compartmentalized cell structure meant those arrests had not produced intelligence that damaged any other cell's operations. The financial network, built through legitimate businesses in the Queenie structure, had not been significantly disrupted, and the supply chains, cocaine from Colombia, meth precursor chemicals from China, distribution networks reaching American cities, continued functioning because they were run by cells that the arrested operators genuinely knew nothing about. The organization didn't just survive the 2015 crackdown, it used the pressure as a selection mechanism. The operators who were caught were those who had made security errors. The ones who remained were those who hadn't. By 2016, CJNG distribution networks had been confirmed in cities across the United States. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Atlanta, and dozens of secondary markets in between. The organization was not competing with Sinaloa for street-level retail distribution. It was operating at the wholesale level, supplying product to existing distribution networks regardless of their organizational affiliation. The CJNG would sell to anyone who could pay and who didn't represent a security risk. Organizational loyalty in the American distribution market was a Sinaloa concept. The CJNG treated it as a market. Then came the chemical that would change everything, not just for the CJNG's revenues, but for American public health, in ways that would eventually register in the tens of thousands of deaths per year. Fentanyl. A synthetic opioid originally developed for medical use, 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, manufacturable from chemical precursors rather than agricultural crops. No poppy fields required, no harvest season, no weather risk. Pure industrial chemistry, scalable to any volume a manufacturer had the precursors and equipment to produce. The CJNG began acquiring fentanyl manufacturing capacity around 2016, initially producing the drug in small quantities and testing American market penetration through existing distribution networks. The market response was immediate. Fentanyl was cheaper to produce than heroin and dramatically more potent. A quantity the size of a few grains of salt was enough to kill an adult. The dosing precision required to use it without fatal overdose was beyond what street-level drug use typically allowed. Americans were dying. The deaths drove news coverage. The news coverage described an opioid crisis, and the CJNG, watching the demand signals, scaled up. By 2018, fentanyl had become the organization's most profitable product line. Daniel Ruiz, still working the CJNG case from Guadalajara, had by this point accumulated more than 6 years of documentation on the organization's growth. His reports had grown longer and more specific. His resource requests had been partially addressed. He had a small team now, 4 analysts and 2 additional field officers. They were tracking an organization that operated across 40 countries and generated estimated revenues of $50 billion annually. 4 analysts, 2 field officers. Ruiz had a map on the wall of his office. It had started with pins in Jalisco, Colima, and Nayarit. By 2018, the pins covered most of Mexico, spread across Central America, reached into Europe, touched Australia and Southeast Asia. He added pins as confirmed operations were documented. He ran out of a colour of pin once and had to switch to a different colour. He ordered more pins, and somewhere in the analysis he was building, buried in financial records and shipping manifests and testimony from mid-level arrested operators, was a thread he hadn't yet pulled, a medical supply chain of all things, that appeared to be receiving protection at a level that seemed entirely disproportionate to its commercial value. He flagged it, put it in a report, and waited to see if anyone told him what it meant. The medical supply chain that Daniel Ruiz had flagged in his 2018 report was not, on its surface, remarkable. It consisted of pharmaceutical deliveries, dialysis equipment and the consumable supplies that dialysis machines require to function, moving through a network of clinics and private medical providers across rural Jalisco. The deliveries were regular, documented, and attached to legitimate medical invoices. The patients receiving the treatment were listed in clinic records. Everything about it looked exactly like what it claimed to be. What made Ruiz flag it was a single anomaly in the protection pattern. The routes used by the delivery vehicles, small trucks, unmarked, running on schedules that didn't align with any commercial logic, were consistently free of CJNG checkpoint activity. Every other vehicle moving through those mountain corridors was subject to the informal taxation and inspection that the CJNG applied to all traffic in its territory. These trucks passed through without stopping, without being waved over, without the 2-minute delay that every other vehicle, regardless of its contents, experienced at every informal checkpoint in the region. Someone was making sure those trucks moved without interruption. Ruiz cross-referenced the delivery schedules with known CJNG operational patterns and found something that took him 3 separate analyses to accept as a real correlation rather than a coincidence. The delivery frequency matched the standard medical schedule for a patient receiving dialysis 3 times per week, not a clinic serving multiple patients on a rotating schedule. 1 patient, 3 sessions per week. The equipment quantity in each delivery, confirmed through customs records on the medical supplies, was consistent with a single machine and a single patient's consumables. The most wanted man in the world had kidney disease. Chronic kidney failure requiring dialysis is not a condition that allows for ordinary disappearance. A person dependent on dialysis cannot simply vanish into a mountain range and survive, not without bringing the mountain range everything it needs to keep them alive. The machine itself is manageable. Portable dialysis units exist, designed for home use, and the CJNG would have had no difficulty acquiring them through legitimate medical supply chains in multiple countries. But the consumables, the filters, the dialysate solution, the sterile tubing that must be replaced with each session, require continuous resupply. They have finite shelf lives. They cannot be stockpiled indefinitely. 3 times a week, somewhere in those mountains, a delivery was keeping Nemesio or Ceguera Cervantes alive. Ruiz understood immediately what this meant operationally. It was not just a vulnerability, a trail that could theoretically be followed to its endpoint. It was an explanation. The dialysis supply chain was the thread that, if followed carefully enough, led to wherever Mencho was at any given moment. It explained why the trucks were protected. It explained why the protection was consistent even as other CJNG operations shifted and reorganized under pressure. The supply chain couldn't be disrupted or rerouted quickly, the way drug shipments could be redirected. It ran on a medical schedule. It was in the universe of criminal operations uniquely and unalterably predictable. He wrote it up, submitted the report, requested authorization to begin active surveillance of the supply chain. Then, 6 weeks later, something happened that made the dialysis thread suddenly irrelevant, or rather, that made it clear why following it had already been tried and had already failed before Ruiz had ever noticed the anomaly. On April 8th, 2015, 3 weeks before the helicopter was shot down, before the army convoy operation that had defined the public understanding of CJNG's military capacity, the Mexican government had held a press conference. A senior official from the Attorney General's office stood before cameras and announced a significant development in the operation against the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Intelligence, the official stated, indicated that Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes had been killed or gravely wounded in a recent military operation in Jalisco. The organization was believed to be in a state of internal crisis as a result. The press conference was covered internationally. American agencies were notified. The reward poster was internally flagged for potential status update. 8 days later, a video appeared. It had been filmed outdoors, in what appeared to be a rural Jalisco setting. In the video, a man spoke directly to the camera, identified himself, and stated his name clearly. He was alive, visibly and unmistakably alive. He addressed the announcement of his death with the specific contempt of someone who had known the announcement was coming and had prepared the rebuttal in advance. The Mexican government had announced the death of El Mencho. El Mencho had filmed a response. The press conference had not been an error. It had not been based on genuinely mistaken intelligence. Internal investigations, none of which produced public findings, examined the sourcing of the claim and found that the intelligence suggesting Mencho's death or injury had originated from within the Mexican federal system itself. Someone inside the government had introduced false information into the official intelligence stream, triggering the announcement. The purpose, whether to protect an informant, to create cover for a specific operation, to generate political credit or something else entirely, was never publicly established. What was established, beyond any reasonable interpretation, was the depth of CJNG penetration into the institutional structures that were supposed to be fighting it. This was not an isolated incident, as arrests accumulated through 2016, 2017, and 2018. Middle management figures, regional coordinators, logistics operators, the testimony that emerged in both Mexican and American proceedings began painting a picture of state infiltration that went beyond bribed officials looking the other way. It described active operatives, people who held legitimate government positions and whose primary function, in operational terms, was to serve the CJNG. One arrest in 2017 produced a defendant who had been simultaneously serving as a commander in a Mexican state police tactical unit and as a regional security coordinator for the CJNG. He had been attending official briefings about anti-CJNG operations in the morning and forwarding their contents to CJNG leadership by the afternoon. He had been doing this, testimony indicated, for approximately 4 years. Another case, in 2018, involved a federal prosecutor whose office had been responsible for building cases against CJNG-linked defendants. Documents recovered from the prosecutor's personal devices showed communication with CJNG figures about the status of specific investigations, the identity of witnesses, and the evidentiary strength of pending cases. Witnesses in those cases had a statistically improbable tendency to recant or become unavailable. The CJNG had not merely corrupted individual officials, it had identified which institutional positions provided the most operationally valuable access and had systematically placed or recruited people into those specific positions. It was not corruption as a defense mechanism, a cartel paying to be left alone. It was corruption as an offensive intelligence tool. Ruiz, reading the arrest reports as they accumulated, returned to a question that the dialysis supply chain discovery had temporarily displaced. If the CJNG had people inside the intelligence structures tracking Mencho's location, and the evidence increasingly suggested it did, then his own surveillance requests submitted through official channels were potentially being read by the organization he was investigating before any field operation could act on them. He stopped submitting certain categories of information through standard channels. He began maintaining a parallel set of notes that existed only on paper, in a notebook he carried personally, never entered into any networked system. Whether that precaution was enough was a question he couldn't answer, because he had no way of knowing how deep the penetration went, or whether his own immediate environment was compromised in ways he couldn't detect. The biographical file on Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, accumulated across decades of Mexican and American records, contained one additional layer of instability that made operational planning against him structurally difficult. His identity itself was inconsistent across documents in ways that went beyond the birthplace dispute noted in his earliest records. His age, as calculated from different official documents, varied by as much as 3 years depending on which record set was used. Physical descriptions from the limited confirmed sightings in the early 2000s disagreed on height and weight in ranges that exceeded normal estimation error. The name Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes appeared in records, but so did variants, Ruben Oseguera, Nemesio Cervantes, combinations that suggested either a history of document fraud or transcription errors accumulated across decades of bureaucratic processing. Intelligence analysts who worked the file full-time developed the uneasy professional habit of treating everything in it as provisional. Every confirmed fact was one document revision away from becoming uncertain. The photograph on the reward poster, that blurry low-resolution image from 2012, remained the best confirmed visual identification of the man after more than a decade of dedicated effort by agencies with significant surveillance resources. He had, in a very specific and operational sense, ceased to exist as a documentable person. He existed as a consequence, in the violence attributed to his orders, in the financial flows traced to his organization, in the testimony of people who claimed to have been in his presence but whose accounts were individually unverifiable. The man was not missing. He was present everywhere his organization operated. But the person, the biological human being named Nemesio, had become a kind of legal ghost, traceable only by the machine that kept him alive 3 times a week. Ruiz's surveillance request on the dialysis supply chain, submitted in 2018, was approved through official channels in late 2019. By the time field teams began attempting to follow the supply routes in early 2020, the delivery patterns had changed completely. Different trucks, different schedules, different routes, the anomaly that had made the supply chain identifiable, the consistent predictable protection exemption at CJNG checkpoints, was gone. The delivery still happened somewhere, but the signature Ruiz had identified had been modified in ways that eliminated the trackable pattern. Someone had read his report. By 2019, the CJNG was fighting on 4 fronts simultaneously, not defensively, offensively, expanding into territories held by established organizations with the same systematic pressure it had applied to smaller groups in its early years, except now with the resources of a $50 billion annual operation behind each push. The Sinaloa cartel, historically Mexico's most powerful trafficking organization, was being challenged in states it had controlled for decades. The remnants of the Zetas, now fragmented into successor organizations, were being absorbed or destroyed in the Gulf and northeastern regions. Independent operators in Michoacán, the state that shared a long border with Jalisco and had its own deep history of organized crime, were being given the same choice the CJNG had always offered: a line or be removed. The difference between 2019 and 2012 was scale. The CJNG of 2012 had been a dangerous regional force with national ambitions. The CJNG of 2019 was a military organization with criminal revenues. Its fighters in contested territories wore body armor and carried weapons that matched or exceeded the equipment of the Mexican military units sent against them. In Michoacán, CJNG convoys moved through rural areas in armored trucks, civilian vehicles that had been reinforced with steel plate welded to the interior, capable of withstanding rifle fire from standard military weapons. The trucks carried mounted weapons. They moved in formation. Mexican military commanders reviewing footage of these convoys noted in internal reports that the tactical formations were correct, that whoever was organizing CJNG ground operations in Michoacán understood military convoy doctrine. The organization wasn't mimicking military behavior, it was executing it. The violence that accompanied this expansion was not contained to the criminal organizations involved. That had never been the CJNG's pattern, but the scale of civilian impact in this period reached dimensions that forced the conflict into international visibility in ways that earlier violence had not. In the state of Michoacán, CJNG offensives in 2020 and 2021 displaced entire communities. Families who had farmed the same land for generations, loading what they could carry into vehicles and leaving because the alternative was staying in the middle of a war between organizations that had no particular interest in their survival. One displacement event in early 2022 moved approximately 20,000 people from their homes in a single month. 20,000. The number appeared in United Nations reports on internal displacement. It appeared in congressional testimony in Washington. It appeared on the front pages of newspapers in Mexico City that had been covering cartel violence for years and had developed a certain editorial tolerance for the subject. And even those papers treated the Michoacán displacement as something different in character from what had come before. The CJNG's response to coverage like this was, in organizational terms, no response at all. The press attention did not alter operations. The UN reports did not prompt any visible change in conduct. The organization operated on a logic where civilian displacement was neither a goal nor a problem. It was simply a byproduct of territorial assertion, as operationally neutral as the weather. Then the family began to fracture. Ruben Oseguera González had grown up inside the organization his father built. Known as El Menchito, Little Mencho, he had moved through the CJNG's operational structure in the way that sons of leaders move through family businesses, faster than merit alone would have justified, with an authority that derived partly from capability and partly from the name. He was not, by the accounts of people who worked with him, without ability. He understood logistics. He was comfortable with operational decisions that required immediate violence. What he was not was invisible. American and Mexican intelligence had been tracking El Menchito since the mid-2000s, when his role in CJNG operations became substantial enough to generate a documented operational profile. He was more visible than his father in every sense, more present in locations that could be monitored, more connected to people whose communications were intercepted, more likely to appear in the peripheral surveillance of operations targeting his associates. In February 2020, El Menchito was arrested. The arrest happened in Mexico through a joint Mexican-American operation. The specific operational details of how intelligence was gathered and acted upon without the information being compromised beforehand remain classified. What happened after the arrest was, in terms of its implications for the family, straightforward. Extradition proceedings began immediately. The American indictment was already prepared. Within months, Ruben Oseguera González was transferred to U.S. federal custody, transported across the border that his father had first crossed as a low-level heroin trafficker in the late 1980s, and placed in a facility where the $10 million reward for his father's location was, in a sense, the backdrop to every conversation his American prosecutors wanted to have with him. The CJNG did not pause. It did not negotiate for his release. It did not redirect resources toward any operation that could be interpreted as an attempt to recover him. The organization absorbed the loss of the leader's son the way it absorbed every other personnel loss, by continuing. 3 months after El Menchito's arrest, Rosalinda González Valencia, Nemesio's wife, the woman whose family had provided the financial infrastructure that made the CJNG's growth possible, was arrested by Mexican authorities in Jalisco. The Queenie financial network had been the subject of intensive investigation by the US Treasury and Mexican financial intelligence units for years. Her brother Abigail had been arrested in 2015. Multiple other Queenie family members had been prosecuted in various jurisdictions. The network had been damaged, restructured, and damaged again, each time demonstrating a resilience that reflected both the depth of its legitimate business integration and the difficulty of proving in court that specific financial transactions were criminal rather than commercial. Rosalinda's arrest was the closest the law had come to the centre of the organisation, and still, the CJNG operated. The fentanyl continued crossing the border. The displacement continued in Michoacán. The supply routes continued functioning. The revenue continued flowing. The arrests of a son and a wife had touched Nemesio's family in the most direct possible way, and the organisation he had built did not require either of them to function. That was either the proof of his organisational genius or the most precise measure of what he'd constructed in place of a life. Depending on the angle, both readings were accurate. Daniel Ruiz had been working the CJNG case for nearly a decade by the time the intelligence break came. It arrived not through his surveillance requests or his parallel notebook or any of the methodical analytical work he'd been doing. It arrived through testimony, a mid-level CJNG financial operator, arrested in a separate money laundering investigation in 2021, who decided during the third week of detention that the trajectory of his legal situation was not going to improve without intervention. The testimony was specific in ways that testimony from that level of the organisation rarely was. The operator had been involved in managing the supply logistics for several of Nemesio's personal operational needs, not the drug supply chains, but the infrastructure of his personal concealment, locations, movement patterns, the rotation schedule between safe houses in the Jalisco mountains, and the medical supply logistics, which by this point had been restructured multiple times, but which the operator could describe in its current configuration. 3 locations, a rotation between them that followed a schedule tied to the dialysis sessions, a specific mountain area in eastern Jalisco, where 2 of the 3 locations were situated within 20 kilometers of each other. Ruiz spent 6 weeks verifying the testimony against everything else he had. Satellite imagery of the indicated area showed infrastructure consistent with habitation in locations that had no registered structures, power lines running to cleared areas in the forest, vehicle tracks on paths that didn't appear on any map. Aerial thermal surveillance, authorized through a process that deliberately bypassed the standard Mexican federal approval chain, detected heat signatures consistent with generator operation at 2 of the 3 indicated locations. The case for a capture operation was assembled. The intelligence was assessed as high confidence, higher than anything Ruiz had worked with in nearly 10 years on the case. American and Mexican military planners developed an operational plan that accounted for CJNG defensive capabilities based on everything learned from the 2015 helicopter incident. The plan was reviewed at the highest levels of both the Mexican military and the US agencies involved. It was ready. The operation had a date. Then, 11 days before that date, the Mexican government made a decision. The authorization was withdrawn. No explanation was provided through official channels that satisfied the American agencies involved. The Mexican government's stated position was that the intelligence required additional verification before an operation of that scale and risk could be authorized. The American assessment of the intelligence, high confidence, verified through multiple independent streams, was noted and, in the formal diplomatic language of the response, respectfully disagreed with. Ruiz received the news on a Tuesday morning. He sat with it for a while. Then he looked at the map on his wall, the one with pins representing confirmed CJNG operations across 5 continents, the one where he had run out of one colour and switched to another, and he added nothing. He just looked at it. The operation that had been 11 days from execution was stood down. The personnel dispersed. The surveillance assets were reassigned. The specific intelligence about the 3 locations in eastern Jalisco, intelligence with a shelf life, intelligence that became less accurate with every day that passed without action, began aging. Within 3 weeks of the stand down, the thermal signatures at the 2 indicated locations disappeared. The vehicle tracks in the satellite imagery showed activity consistent with evacuation. The locations were empty. Someone had known the operation was coming, and in the specific geography of who had access to that information, a list that was finite, documented, and had been deliberately kept small, the answer to who that someone was pointed in a direction that neither government was prepared to publicly acknowledge. The authorization hadn't been withdrawn because the intelligence needed more verification. It had been withdrawn because verifying it further would have confirmed something that the Mexican government was not prepared to act on. In the years after the aborted operation, a specific kind of silence settled over the official pursuit of Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes. Not the silence of abandonment. The reward remained posted, the indictments remained active, the DEA continued allocating resources to the case. It was the silence of an investigation that had reached the boundary of what official channels could accomplish, and was waiting, without admitting it was waiting, for something to change in the environment around the target rather than in the target itself. Nemesio had not been seen, not confirmed, not rumoured with any specificity, not placed in any location with the kind of sourcing that could survive scrutiny. His last verified appearance, the 2015 video responding to the false death announcement, was now years old. The man who had built an organisation present on 5 continents had reduced his own presence to something smaller than a rumour. 3 dialysis sessions per week, somewhere in mountains that covered thousands of square kilometres. That was all that could be said with confidence about where Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes was on any given day in 2023. His health had become the subject of significant analytical attention in intelligence circles. Chronic kidney failure without a transplant follows a progressive course that dialysis slows but does not stop. The cardiovascular strain of the long-term dialysis dependency accumulates over years. Reports from sources inside the CJNG's medical logistics network, sources of varying reliability, described a man whose physical condition had deteriorated significantly from the figure in the 2015 video. One report, which American analysts assessed as possibly credible, described difficulty walking unaided. Another described cognitive effects consistent with the neurological complications that can accompany advanced kidney disease. None of these reports could be verified. They were filed, they were noted, they aged. While Nemesio receded into medical uncertainty, the legal consequences for his family continued accumulating with the grinding consistency of a system that moves slowly but does not stop. Jessica Johanna Oseguera Gonzalez, his daughter, known in CJNG operational communications by the name La Negra, had been indicted in the United States on charges related to her role in the cartel's financial operations. She had been involved, according to the indictment, in managing businesses that served as fronts for CJNG money laundering, a role that placed her squarely within the Queenie family tradition of financial architecture, applied now to the second generation. In 2021, Jessica Johanna pleaded guilty in US federal court. The plea was significant not because of what it revealed about the CJNG's operations. The information she provided to prosecutors was carefully managed through her legal representation and the extent of her cooperation remained sealed, but because of what it represented structurally. 2 of Nemesio's children were now in American custody. His wife had been arrested in Mexico. His brother-in-law Abigail had been in custody since 2015. The family that had formed the personal and financial core of the organization was, one by one, being removed from the board. The organization kept playing. The fentanyl numbers told the story that no organizational chart or court document could fully convey. In 2022, more than 100,000 Americans died of drug overdoses, a number that surpassed in a single year American combat deaths in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars combined. Fentanyl was the primary driver of that figure. Not all of that fentanyl moved through CJNG supply chains. Sinaloa remained a significant producer, but the CJNG's share of the American fentanyl market was substantial enough that its removal, if it had been possible, would have registered immediately in the overdose statistics. The pills were pressed in factories in Mexico using precursor chemicals shipped from China. They were moved across the southern border through ports of entry hidden in legitimate cargo, through tunnels, through the postal system in quantities small enough that individual packages didn't trigger screening algorithms. They reached distribution networks in American cities that had no direct connection to Mexico. No cartel members, no Mexican nationals, simply existing drug distribution infrastructure that had found a new supplier offering a dramatically more profitable product than anything previously available. A single kilogram of fentanyl purchased at the manufacturing level in Mexico could be pressed into approximately 1 million pills and sold in American retail markets for revenues in the millions of dollars. The profit margin exceeded anything else the organization trafficked by an order of magnitude. Fentanyl had not just become the CJNG's most profitable product, it had become the most profitable product in the history of drug trafficking, and it required no poppy fields, no harvest, no agricultural infrastructure in Mexico that could be identified and eradicated. Pure chemistry, scalable and invisible. In Jalisco, in the towns where Nemesio had grown up, and where the CJNG had its deepest roots, the organization's presence expressed itself in the textures of daily life in ways that were simultaneously ordinary and total. Murals appeared on walls, painted by local artists, sometimes commissioned, sometimes spontaneous, depicting El Mencho as a figure of regional pride. The imagery drew on the same visual tradition used for narco corridos, the folk ballads that had been celebrating drug traffickers in Mexico since the 1970s. A strong man from humble origins who had risen beyond what the system said was possible for someone from his background. In the same towns, in some cases on adjacent streets, there were memorials. Handmade markers for people killed in CJNG operations. Not rival cartel members, but ordinary people who had been in the wrong location at a moment of organizational violence, or who had refused a demand, or who had been related to someone the organization wanted to send a message through. The murals and the memorials coexisted without apparent tension. The community had absorbed both as facts of the same landscape. This duality, the cartel as provider and the cartel as predator, operating simultaneously in the same geographic and social space, was not unique to CJNG territory. It was a consistent feature of how large criminal organizations embedded themselves in communities over decades. But the depth of the CJNG's embedding in Jalisco was specific in ways that distinguished it even within that broader pattern. The CJNG had, over the years of its operation, provided services in areas where the Mexican state had withdrawn or never fully arrived: dispute resolution, protection from other criminal actors, employment for young men with limited legal economic options, infrastructure investment in some rural areas. These services were not charitable. They created obligation, dependency, and loyalty that was more durable than the loyalty produced by fear alone. A community that received its water infrastructure from the CJNG and its employment from CJNG-affiliated construction companies was a community that would not willingly produce informants. The Mexican federal government had changed administrations twice since the CJNG's founding. Each incoming administration had announced a new security strategy, new frameworks, new priorities, new organizational structures for addressing organized crime. The CJNG had outlasted each strategy, not by defeating it directly, but by continuing to operate while the strategy's attention eventually moved elsewhere. El Menchito, in American federal custody, became the subject of intense legal maneuvering in the years after his extradition. His case moved through the American federal court system with a deliberate pace of complex criminal prosecutions, pretrial motions, evidentiary hearings, procedural processes that stretched months into years. The question of his cooperation, whether he had provided or would provide information about his father's location or about CJNG operational specifics, was addressed publicly only through what was not said. His lawyers made no statements about cooperation. Prosecutors made no statements about cooperation. The case file contained sealed sections whose contents were not accessible to any public review. He had grown up knowing everything. That was the implication of his role. He had grown up inside the organization from childhood, not as a peripheral family member, but as an operational participant whose authority derived directly from his position as the leader's son. What he knew about locations, supply chains, financial structures, and personnel was potentially the most comprehensive single intelligence resource on the CJNG that any agency had ever had in custody. Whether that resource was being used, and to what effect, remained, deliberately and completely, unknown. Daniel Ruiz retired from the DEA in 2022 after 18 years of service, the last 10 of which had been spent working the CJNG case from Guadalajara. His retirement was processed without ceremony. He cleared his office over a weekend, took the paper notebook, the one he had kept separate from all network systems, and left the building on a Friday afternoon. The map with the pins stayed on the wall for his successor. He had not captured Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes. He had not produced a confirmed location that was acted upon in time. What he had produced was the most comprehensive analytical record of the CJNG's operational architecture that existed in any government file, a record that subsequent analysts would work from for years, that would inform prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions, that would help dismantle specific nodes of the organization's financial network, even as the organization itself continued operating. Whether that amounted to success was a question Ruiz had stopped asking himself sometime around 2020. It had ceased to be a useful question. The CJNG entered 2024 with its leadership structure intact below the level of Nemesio himself. Regional commanders had absorbed the functions that had previously required his direct involvement. Financial operations continued moving through structures that had been rebuilt after the Queenie arrests. The fentanyl supply chain was, if anything, more efficient than it had been 3 years earlier. The logistics had been refined through years of operational experience, and the competitive pressure of American interdiction efforts had produced a distribution system that was faster, more compartmentalized, and harder to map than what had preceded it. The organization did not need Nemesio to function. This was the fact that sat at the center of everything, the fact that made the $10 million reward feel, to the analysts who had spent careers trying to claim it, increasingly abstract. Capturing or killing the man who built the CJNG would be a significant symbolic event. It would produce prosecutorial consequences. It would end one human life that had generated an enormous quantity of destruction. It would not end the organization. The machine he had built was running. Somewhere in the mountains of Jalisco, another machine was running too. Smaller, quieter, essential in a completely different way, keeping one man alive 3 times a week, in a location that remained, despite everything, unknown. But the question of whether Nemesio or Ceguera Cervantes was still alive at all, whether the man at the center of the most wanted designation in American law enforcement history was still breathing, still connected to the machine, still present in any operational sense within the organization, had no confirmed answer. The CJNG operated as if he were alive. It would operate exactly the same way if he weren't. The soldiers who survived the May 2015 convoy operation reached the abandoned camp on foot, moving carefully through terrain that their training told them to treat as hostile until every meter of it had been cleared. The burned vehicles were still smoking at the edges. The camp itself, the logistics hub the operation had been sent to disrupt, had been stripped with a speed that spoke of rehearsal, not emergency packing. Rehearsed evacuation executed on a signal, leaving behind only what had no value and no identifying information. They found the wall at the camp's northern perimeter. Concrete block, roughly finished, the kind of construction that appears across rural Mexico wherever someone needed a windbreak or a boundary marker without caring about aesthetics. The paint was black, applied in large, deliberate strokes, not hurried. The letters were even, the spacing considered. Someone had painted this message knowing there would be readers, and had taken the time to make it legible. The soldier who first approached the wall stopped at a distance of approximately 4 meters. He stayed there long enough that the man behind him moved up to see what had caused the pause. Then that man stopped too. What the wall said was not a threat. It contained no specific targets, no named enemies, no operational communication of any kind. It was 7 words in Spanish, painted on a concrete wall in the mountains of Jalisco, in a camp that had been designed to vanish without trace. El gobierno no nos puede. Nosotros somos el gobierno. The government cannot beat us. We are the government. The photograph of that wall, taken by a soldier, circulated internally, classified before it reached any press outlet, was not classified because the message was operationally sensitive. It was classified because the message was accurate. That was the problem, not the boast of an organization claiming superiority over the state, a diagnosis. 7 words that described, with a precision that no intelligence report had managed in the same brevity, the actual structural condition of the relationship between the CJNG and the Mexican state apparatus it had spent 15 years infiltrating, corrupting, and in certain functional respects replacing. The government cannot beat us. We are the government. The general who was briefed on the wall's contents reportedly left the room and did not return for 20 minutes. The detail that has stayed in the accounts of people present that day is not the leaving, it is the returning. He came back, sat down, continued the briefing. The work continued because the work always continues, regardless of what is written on walls. But the words had named something that everyone in that room already knew and had been carefully not saying. Go back to the beginning of this story. A boy in Jalisco, one of 11 children, dirt floors, borrowed shoes, watching men in good trucks move through a landscape that offered very few alternatives to watching. A young man who chose the uniform, the badge, the legitimate path, and found that the legitimate path and the criminal one shared the same physical space, the same institutional structure, the same chain of command in certain crucial respects. A police officer who crossed a border, was arrested, was processed by a system that took his fingerprints and filed them and moved on. None of those moments looked, from the inside, like the origin of anything significant. They looked like ordinary life in a specific geography at a specific time. The unremarkable accumulation of circumstances that shapes every person without announcing its direction. The fingerprints taken in Fresno County in 1992 are still in the file. The file is thicker now. Thousands of pages, dozens of jurisdictions, a reward poster with a photograph that is now more than a decade old. The man those fingerprints belong to has not been photographed with any confirmed clarity since 2012. In an era when almost every human being on Earth is photographed daily, by phones, by security cameras, by satellites capable of reading license plates from orbit, the most wanted person in the Western Hemisphere has managed something that should be statistically impossible. He has remained unseen, not because the technology failed, not because the resources were insufficient, because the system that was supposed to find him had been, in specific and functional ways, incorporated into the system that was protecting him. The CJNG, as of the time this story was assembled, operates in more countries than most multinational corporations. Its fentanyl supply chains reach into communities across the United States that have no awareness of any connection to a cartel in Jalisco, small cities in the Midwest, rural counties in Appalachia, suburbs of cities that have never appeared in any news story about drug trafficking. The distance between the mountain camp with the painted wall and the county hospital in Ohio, where an overdose patient arrives on a Tuesday afternoon, is, in supply chain terms, 2 or 3 logistics handoffs. 3 degrees of separation between the organization and the consequence. 100,000 Americans per year. That is the number that the fentanyl era has produced in overdose deaths, each year. A number that accumulates while the investigation continues, while the reward poster ages, while the dialysis machine runs on its schedule somewhere in mountains that have not given up their location. The children who grew up in CJNG controlled communities in Jalisco during the organization's decade of dominance are now adults. Some of them work for the organization, drawn by the same economic logic that shaped their parents' generation and their grandparents before that. Some of them left for Guadalajara, for Mexico City, for the United States. Some of them are the people who paint the murals. Some of them are the people the murals are painted for, not over. The town of Aguililla in Michoacán, the municipality that some records list as Nemesio's birthplace, the place this story may have actually started, became, in 2021, the site of one of the most intense CJNG offensives of the organization's entire history. The community that may have produced the man was occupied, fought over, and partially displaced by the organization bearing his name. Whether that circularity was visible to anyone still connected to the operation, whether anyone noted that the place of origin had become a battlefield, is not recorded anywhere. Daniel Ruiz, in retirement, kept the paper notebook. He did not publish it, did not submit it to any official archive, did not speak to journalists. He had spent a decade learning that information moved in the wrong direction whenever it entered certain systems, and that caution had become structural to how he handled anything connected to the case. The notebook stayed with him. What it contained, the parallel record of a decade's analysis, the observations that couldn't go into networked reports, the assessments of where the penetration went and how deep, remained in his possession. He occasionally read it, not to revisit the failures, to remember that the investigation had produced real understanding of how the organization was built, of how the financial architecture functioned, of how the counter-surveillance operated, even when that understanding hadn't produced the outcome the $10 million reward was designed to generate. Understanding and capture were different things. He had achieved one. There is a final fact about Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes that sits outside all the operational analysis and organizational architecture and geopolitical consequence. It is the most human detail in the entire story, and it is the one that law enforcement found most operationally significant precisely because it is so human. He is sick. He's been sick for years. The machine that keeps him alive requires supplies that must be delivered on a schedule that cannot be significantly compressed or extended. 3 times a week, without exception, his body requires something from the outside world. 3 times a week, the most carefully concealed man in the Western Hemisphere creates a need, a logistical dependency, a moment of connection between his hidden location and a supply chain that originates somewhere in the documented world. 3 times a week, the ghost needs something. The DEA knows this. The Mexican military knows this. Every analyst who has worked the case in the last several years knows that somewhere in the mountains of Jalisco, a delivery is being made to a location that their surveillance has not yet confirmed and their operations have not yet reached. The supply chain has been restructured, rerouted, disguised, but it exists. It cannot not exist. The physics of human biology are not subject to the same operational flexibility as drug shipment routes. Every 3 sessions, the window opens. Every 3 sessions, someone knows which truck, which road, which clearing in which mountain fold, and chooses, for whatever reason, out of loyalty or fear or genuine belief or simple self-interest, not to make that information available for $10 million. Go back to the convoy. Go back to the wall. El gobierno no nos puede. Nosotros somos el gobierno. 7 words painted by someone who either believed them completely or was ordered to paint them by someone who did. 7 words that became classified not because they were false, but because the people who read them recognized what they described. The boy from the dirt floors built something that the richest government in the world, working in partnership with the Mexican state, has spent a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to dismantle. And the organization is larger now than when they started. His son is in American custody. His wife was arrested. His daughter pleaded guilty in federal court. His brother-in-law is in prison. The family has been taken apart person by person. The organization has not noticed. That is either the measure of how well he built it, or the measure of how far the building went beyond him, how thoroughly the CJNG became something that no longer required its founder to exist in order to continue existing. The man may be dying in a mountain location that no satellite has confirmed. The cartel will not attend the funeral. Somewhere in eastern Jalisco, a generator hums. The machine runs its cycle. The filters process. The tubing carries what the kidneys cannot. A man who was born into poverty, who chose a uniform, who crossed a border, who sat in an American federal prison and studied how systems worked from the inside out, who came home to a country at war and built a war machine of his own. That man breathes. Or he doesn't. The organization doesn't require the answer. Neither in the end does the wall.